Before we write any code, we have to understand how authentication works in Vue apps, or to be precise, in any single page application. Because it's a bit different than the traditional authentication you might know from websites and web applications where you use some server-side language. We're not doing this here. Vue runs in the browser, therefore this will work a bit differently. So we have our Vue app or any single page application using any library or framework, doesn't have to be Vue, and we got our backend server. In our case, that's Firebase, but it could be any HTTP server to which we send requests, any REST API or GraphQL API. Now, the thing is that on this server, we have certain public resources, but also some restricted resources. For example, in our course project, we might be able to get coaches and send messages to coaches without being logged in. So that would be public data and public resources, which should be accessible by any visitor of this web page, no matter if you are logged in or not. But then we also got some resources, some data, some kinds of requests that should be restricted. For example, you should only be able to register as a coach and therefore create a new coach if you are logged in. The same for fetching requests, fetching messages you as a coach received. Of course, you need to be logged in to do that. So we got mixed data on our server, and that's a typical scenario. In most websites, you will have some data that should be accessible by anyone and some data that's restricted. Now, the thing is, with this setup where our web application, our website, is kind of detached from the backend, it's not served by the same server, and the backend doesn't really know the front end. In such scenarios, the server really does not care about the clients, so about the Vue application in this case. The server, in our case Firebase, but again you could be using any API, really does not care about our Vue app. It doesn't store any information about that app. It doesn't store whether the user of this app instance is actually logged in or not. Therefore, we'll have to find a way of still keeping track whether the visitor of the web page who's currently using the website is logged in or not. Now, of course, it always all starts by some login data being sent from the Vue app to the server. We have some login page in our Vue app, and once the user entered an email address and a password, that data is sent to the server to create the user or to log the user in. And now on traditional websites, the server would basically store a session. It would store information about that user and just send a session ID to the front end, to the browser, so that there is a connection between the user using the site in the browser and the server being aware of that user. However, that's not how it'll work here when you have a single page application talking to an API. Instead, here, the server doesn't store any information and it'll do something else. It'll send back a token back to the front end, back to the single page application, in our case, back to the Vue app, once that login data is validated and verified. So if it is a valid user who's trying to log in, if that data could be confirmed by the server generates a token, which is in the end just a very long string, which is sent back to the client. Now, the thing about this token is that it's created such that only the server is able to validate it. Only the server will be able to tell if a token is valid or not, because it was generated with a certain secret key which only the server knows. So this token can't be faked. The token is then sent back to the client, and there we can store it. We can store it in Vuex or also in more permanent places like local storage. And the thing with that token now is that it can be attached to these outgoing requests to restricted resources. And if that token is attached, since only the server is able to validate the token, if the server receives a request to a restricted resource with a valid token, the server will grant access and return the appropriate data. If the token is invalid or missing, access is denied. That's how authentication works in single-page applications talking to an API, and that's exactly the setup we have here, and exactly the setup you will have in most Vue applications you're going to build. Therefore, this is the scenario we'll have a look at in this module. Now, of course, in our app, we also want to have some implications of the user being logged in or not on our web page itself, not just on the requests that are being sent. For example, this requests menu item should only be clickable if the user is logged in. We should only be able to register as a coach with the button that is sometimes visible here if we are logged in. Otherwise, we want to offer a login button to the user. So these are also implications of authentication being added to the app. And with that theory out of the way, let's now step by step add authentication and see all of that in action.